Margaret kept her phone on the small table beside her chair, always within reach, even when there were no new messages to check. The screen remained quiet most of the day, lighting up only for reminders or unknown notifications she rarely opened. But there was one thing she returned to again and again without fail. Every evening, just before the sun began to set, she picked up the phone, unlocked it slowly, and opened the same saved voicemail. Her fingers moved carefully, as if the moment itself required gentleness. The room around her was still, filled with a silence that had become familiar over time. As the audio began to play, she closed her eyes, listening closely, not wanting to miss a single word. "Hey, it's me," the voice said softly, warm, calm, and unmistakably his. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened slightly, her breathing slowing as she leaned back in her chair. "I know you might not hear this right away," the voice continued, carrying a quiet ease that felt almost unreal now. "But I just wanted to say I'll be home soon." A faint smile appeared on her face, though her eyes remained closed. She had heard these words countless times, yet they never felt old. They never lost their meaning. The message wasn't long, just a few simple sentences, but to her it held more than anything else in the room. When the voicemail ended, the silence returned instantly, heavier than before. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, her gaze resting on the blank screen. For a moment she didn't move. Then quietly she pressed play again. The voicemail had been there for years, saved carefully, never deleted, never replaced. Margaret didn't remember exactly when she started listening to it every day, but at some point it had become part of her routine, something she depended on more than she would ever admit. The house itself had changed over time, growing quieter, less filled with the sounds it once held, but the voicemail remained the same, untouched, frozen in a moment that refused to move forward. One afternoon, her daughter came to visit, stepping inside with a gentle knock before letting herself in. "Mom," she called softly. Margaret looked up from her chair, offering a small smile. "You're early today," she said. Her daughter nodded, placing her bag down as her eyes briefly moved toward the phone resting beside her. She had seen it before. She knew what it meant. "You've been listening to it again, haven't you?" she asked carefully. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the phone, her fingers resting lightly on the screen. "It helps," she said quietly. Her daughter sat down across from her, her expression soft but concerned. "Mom, it's been a long time," she said gently. Margaret nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the phone. "I know," she replied. There was no denial in her voice, no confusion, just a quiet understanding. Her daughter hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Maybe it's time to let it go." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Margaret finally looked up, her expression calm but distant. "And forget his voice?" she asked softly. The question carried more than just words. It carried years of memories, of moments that could never be replaced. Her daughter didn't answer, because deep down, she already knew there was no simple way to move on from something like that. There was a time when the house was never this quiet, when the sound of his voice didn't come from a phone but filled every room naturally. His name was Robert, and he had a way of speaking that made even the simplest words feel reassuring. He wasn't someone who said too much, but when he did, it always mattered. Margaret often thought about those small moments now, the ones that didn't seem important back then but had somehow become everything. The way he would call out to her from the other room, the way he would remind her about things she had already remembered, the way he always said he would be home soon no matter how late it got. That voicemail wasn't just a message, it was a piece of something that used to be constant, something she never imagined she would lose. One evening, as she sat in her chair again, she pressed play once more, letting his voice fill the silence. This time she didn't close her eyes. She stared ahead, her thoughts drifting back to the last day she saw him. It hadn't felt different. It hadn't felt like something that would become a memory she would return to again and again. "I'll be home soon," he had said before leaving, just like always. Margaret remembered nodding, barely paying attention, already focused on something else. Now that moment replayed in her mind more clearly than anything else. Not because it was special, but because it was the last time those words were ever spoken to her in person. The call had come later that same evening, unexpected and quiet, the kind of call that changes everything without warning. Margaret could still remember the way her hands felt when she answered it, the slight hesitation in her voice before she said hello. The words that followed were calm, careful, but impossible to fully process at once. There had been an accident. The details didn't matter, not in that moment. What mattered was what it meant. Robert wasn't coming home. The words felt distant at first, like they belonged to someone else's life, but slowly, painfully, they became real. In the days that followed, everything seemed to move without her fully understanding how. People came and went, voices filled the house again, but none of them were his. The silence that replaced it afterward felt different from anything she had ever known. It wasn't just quiet, it was absence, a space that nothing else could fill. Weeks later, while going through his things, she found the voicemail. It had been saved automatically, a small detail she would have ignored before, but when she played it, everything changed. His voice, clear and familiar, filled the room once more. "I'll be home soon." The words hit her differently now, carrying a meaning they were never meant to hold. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was the last piece of something she had lost, and from that moment on, she never let it go. The days continued to pass, but the voicemail remained unchanged, untouched by time in a way that everything else wasn't. Margaret still returned to it every evening, the same quiet routine repeating itself without question. But one night felt different. The room seemed heavier, the silence deeper, as if something inside her had finally shifted. She picked up the phone slowly, her fingers resting on the screen longer than usual before pressing play. Robert's voice filled the room again, soft and familiar, carrying the same calm reassurance it always had. "Hey, it's me." Margaret closed her eyes, but this time, something about the moment felt harder to hold on to. The words continued, steady and unchanged, yet they carried a weight she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel before. When the message ended, she didn't press play again immediately. Instead, she kept holding the phone, her grip tightening slightly as her breathing grew uneven. A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another. For the first time, she didn't try to stop it. "You said you'd come back," she whispered, her voice breaking softly in the quiet room. The words hung there, unanswered, just like every other time. But this time, she didn't look away from that truth. She let it stay. She let herself feel it fully. Her thumb hovered over the screen again, ready to replay the message, to return to the comfort she had built around it. But she didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, she lowered the phone slowly, her eyes opening as she stared ahead. The silence that followed felt different now. Not empty, not distant, just real. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to replace it. The next evening arrived quietly, just like all the others before it. The light faded slowly through the window, casting the same soft shadows across the room. Margaret sat in her chair, the phone resting beside her, untouched. For a long moment, she didn't reach for it. She simply sat there, her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts moving more clearly than they had in a long time. The routine was still there, familiar and comforting in its own way. But something inside her had changed. Slowly, she picked up the phone again, holding it gently as her eyes settled on the screen. The saved voicemail was still there, exactly where it had always been. Nothing about it had changed, only her. Her thumb moved toward it, hesitating for a brief second before pressing play. Robert's voice filled the room once more, calm and steady, just as it had been every single time. "Hey, it's me." Margaret listened, her expression expression soft, her breathing steady now. She didn't close her eyes this time. She let the moment stay present, letting his voice exist in the room without trying to hold on to it too tightly. When the message reached its final words, "I'll be home soon," she smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both love and understanding. The voicemail ended, and the silence returned once again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like something she needed to escape from. She looked down at the phone for a moment, her thumb resting on the screen. Then gently, she locked it and placed it back on the table beside her. She leaned back slowly, her gaze lifting toward the quiet room around her. "You were," she said softly, almost as if answering him. "You were always home." The words settled into the space, calm and certain, and for the first time the silence didn't feel like a loss. It felt like something she had finally made peace with, not because she had forgotten him, but because she no longer needed the voicemail to remember him. He was already there in every part of her life, in every quiet moment that followed.